Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream for History Bite podcast. Today, I'm joined by Christopher Lawson, author of Reconstructing Jesus, and Daniel Unterbrink, author of Judas of Nazareth, and also Judas the Galilean, the Flesh and Blood Jesus. So, this is the first time that you two have, yep, that's it. This is the first time you two ever got together for a video. You both have something in common. You both connect Jesus to Judas the Galilean in one form or the other. Dan thinks that Judas the Galilean is the historical Jesus, while Chris believes that Jesus is Judas the Galilean's son. So yeah, welcome to the show, both of you.
Well, Daniel, why don't you start us off and tell us about the fourth philosophy and why you think it relates to Judas the Galilean and his work, and we have that as common ground, so perhaps that'll help our viewers have a foundation for our discussion.
Yep.
Okay, well, basically, when you're looking at the fourth philosophy, that comes from Josephus, and he describes the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the fourth philosophy are the followers of Judas the Galilean. So what I have done, essentially, you go through all the war of the Jews and antiquities of the Jews, and you see everything that's going on, and a lot of it goes around the fourth philosophy. If you're looking for Jesus in Josephus's writings, you really don't find him or any of his teachings, but you see Judas the Galilean over and over again, and then you also see a co-teacher, Sadduc, who very well could have been John the Baptist. So what I've done is build on timelines based on Josephus's writings, and using the New Testament kind of as, looking for things that happened in Josephus's writings that maybe have been turned around a little bit to be put into the gospel story. So I think the important thing when you're looking at everything is to try to go after the timelines. Now, Judas the Galilean is a little earlier than the traditional Jesus figure, and this is probably where Christopher and I will probably go off a little bit from believing that Judas had something to do with the gospel story. He says the son. I say that Judas was the historical Jesus figure.
We'll get into that. Why don't we continue with the fourth philosophy first? So and the links. I'll add a little bit to it here while I'm speaking. Both Judas the Galilean and the fourth philosophy, as represented by Josephus's descriptions, are very pro-law, and they are very leery of foreigners. They are willing to die for Torah observance. So they are that strict. They are very, very devout Jews. They are believers. Josephus represents Judah as a renegade. He represents him as at one point he admits that he's a Sophistase, which means he's a wise man. He represents him as the founder of the fourth philosophy, but he also calls him what's the word I'm looking for? It's the same as the guys hanging on the cross, lestai. So a bandit, yeah, or a troublemaker, brigand. And so Josephus does misrepresent Judah the Galilean, and to some degree misrepresents the fourth philosophy in terms of being rebels. I think he goes to a great deal of pain about this, though, because he's conflicted on it. He knew one of the members of the fourth philosophy, someone named Banus, and he spent years with him learning his ways. And he revered these people. One of the areas where Daniel Unterbrink and I agree is that the martyrs that are usually co-opted by Christians were probably Messianic Jews and part of this fourth philosophy. And Josephus described how when they were tortured, even the children wouldn't give in or call the emperor Lord or do anything to worship idols, etc. They went to their martyrdom nobly, and to such a degree that Josephus went to pains to say his descriptions were not exaggerations, but if there is any conflict between his description and the reality of it, it's that he underestimated how noble they were and how much torture they took. So early Christians took those stories and adopted them, those martyrs, as if they were their own, and they used this as a tool. Why would they die like that if they didn't believe Jesus resurrected? If they didn't believe that, why would they die? And that's not at all what they believed. The fourth philosophy had hope for a resurrection. The Daniel Unterbrink has done a very good job of pointing out some of the similarities between this Judah the Galilean and the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, you cite the Damascus document in their time period. We'll get into that later too.
I think it's interesting when you talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls that some of the materials were found at Masada.
Yes.
Also, which so they were definitely, if not writing some of the materials, at least in possession of the material. And like you said, like you were saying, they would undergo any type of torture. And even at Masada, they committed suicide, right, as opposed to being slaughtered by the Romans.
And so they were led by one Eleazar, who was a descendant of Judah the Galilean.
Exactly. Yeah.
In fact, the word Eleazar is a cognate of Lazarus. So one might suspect that the Lazarus connection in the New Testament could have been an adoption of the name Eleazar into the group. One more little switch and swap in the New Testament story. The documents at Masada, the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice were found the same as identical to the copies from Cave 4 in Dead Sea Scrolls. Also in the Jewish synagogue at Masada, buried under the synagogue floor was a passage from Ezekiel where it talks about dry bones gaining flesh. The resurrection hope was something that they cherished at Masada. They also had songs of the Sabbath sacrifice from same as the Qumran documents there. So you're right. I'm just telling the viewers exactly which documents they had. So I concur with that. The fourth philosophy was pro-law, pro-Torah. And it was this aspect of their philosophy which brought them into conflict with Rome.
Well, it also brought them in conflict with Paul.
Yes.
Read the letter to the Galatians when the followers of James come in, and he calls them the circumcision group, but they were strict law observers.
Yes.
So you can't, I think people today, they look at modern day Christianity and it's really following Paul because, Gentiles are the ones that follow Christianity today.
Right. When we say Christianity, generally we mean Pauline Christianity. We don't see anything else.
Right.
And so that's when I talk about the followers of Jesus, I avoid that issue. I call them Messianic Judaism.
Yeah. Okay.
And that way we can distinguish who's who, because Paul opposed Messianic Judaism and he hijacked it.
Exactly.
Another thing that we share is our common respect for the great research done by Dr. Robert Eisenman.
That's true.
The thoroughness of his research.
Mm-hmm.
We both concur that Paul is the person called the liar in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay.
I think Eisenman has established that very well in his book, James the Just and the Habakkuk Pesher, which came out over 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's ever been refuted. No one has ever done a line-by-line analysis of the Habakkuk Pesher more thoroughly than what Robert Eisenman has done. And I've heard many people, like Chris Hansen and others, putting down Eisenman's research and throwing it out as if you can take that level of deep research and the uncanny matching of details and the intricate linking. And it's such a web of information that it's hard to read Eisenman because he's got so much material on hand from a million different directions. It all fits like a glove.
Mm-hmm.
And they toss that out on some whim, like the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated the wrong date, they say, because of carbon-14. Carbon-14 dates get adjusted all the time on the basis of other reasons. For example, tree ring data, they'll adjust the carbon-14 to say, okay, it's off a little bit. Why would the carbon-14 need adjustment? Well, it's because it's based upon the breakdown of nitrogen in the upper atmosphere into carbon-14 under the effect of cosmic rays. But carbon-14 doesn't stay carbon-14 forever. Every 5,568 years, half of it is converted back to carbon-12. And so people can, when animals that are alive, that eventually have their skin used as the parchment for the scrolls, they're breathing the atmosphere, and their entire life, the ratio of the carbon-12 to the carbon-14 in them gets to be the same ratio as everything else in the environment. When they stop breathing, from that point on, the carbon-14 starts to decay to carbon-12, and it changes the ratios. Mm-hmm. That changing the ratios is what scientists use to figure out the date of when that creature died. Now, several things. First of all, you're dating when the animal died, not the date the scroll was written on. The scroll may have been written on 200 years later on that parchment. And so you don't know the date of the writing just because you know the date the animal died. And even that, it's a range. They don't give you a specific date. They give you, it's somewhere between here, 2/3 likely in the first sigma distribution. And it's 95% likely to be this even wider range. In the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that range in the second sigma distribution is between 200 BCE to 100 AD. And even then, they say 1 out of 20 times, the range will be outside of that date still. So that's how carbon-14 actually works. It doesn't give you a specific nailed and carved in stone date. It gives you a range of probabilities. Furthermore,
Eisenman did always say that he was basing his a lot too, not only on that larger range, but
right.
The internal evidence.
Yes, that's what you have to use.
Scrolls are actually saying.
Yes, going on the basis of the scrolls, the internal data is paramount, and that itself should be used to readjust the carbon-14 date. We know when the scrolls were buried because all the people who buried them were dead by the end of the war. Mm-hmm. So all the scrolls had to be buried before 70 CE. In terms of practical terms, probably before 68 CE, because they wouldn't even have had access to the caves after that date. So we know when the scrolls were hidden. And these scholars who want to reject Eisenman's interpretation are expecting us to believe that all these scrolls that were hidden just before the war didn't include any from their time period. But right. All included only stuff from 200 years before that. That's absurd on the face of it. You go to any library and you have to hurry and hide your library. You're going to have books and scrolls from your time period in that library. It's ridiculous to think that none of them at all could possibly be from Jesus's time, when clearly they were. And so
I think
the idea of rejecting Eisenman on this whim is absurd. Eisenman's research holds up, and the internal data from the scrolls are very clear.
I think it's interesting, though, when you're talking about Paul being the liar.
Yes.
You're talking about internal data. Well, Paul in the gospel, in his letters, always is saying, I do not lie.
Yeah, I'm not lying.
Because the whole idea was, the Jewish group from Jerusalem led by James, he was the liar. So,
right.
He to his people, he's saying, oh, you might have heard things, but I'm not a liar, essentially. Right. So he was he knew what was going on.
Absolutely. And for the viewers, for the viewers, they should know that in the Habakkuk Pesher and in other places such as the Pesher on Psalm 37, the Pesher on Hosea, and other places like that, they occasionally mention this liar in the commentary section of what these texts mean. The traditional way that the Dead Sea Scrolls Pesherim work is they quote a text from the Old Testament, and then they explain in their interpretation what they think it means. For example, they might say, Zechariah, some quote says, the righteous or the wicked encompasses the righteous. And they'll say the interpretation of this means when the wicked priest encompassed the righteous teacher at the time of his exile or something like that. And this is and these interpretations, although we recognize those texts don't actually mean anything like that, what they said they did, we know that they're telling us their sectarian history this way. So the interpretations tell us the history, and that's how we learn that the teacher of righteousness had an opponent called the wicked priest, and he had another opponent. Some people equate this other opponent with the wicked priest, an opponent called the liar. Now, some people like Barbatherian, for example, will say the liar and the wicked priest are the same person. In fact, Barbatherian will say it was Jesus, and that Jesus was the liar and the wicked priest because he was disobeying Torah and all that. And she buys into the New Testament idea that Jesus didn't accept Torah. I disagree with Barbatherian on that. But I agree with her dating of the scrolls in Jesus' time.
Yeah, that was Paul and not Jesus.
Yes, exactly. The liar was Paul.
Actual followers, they were very law observant.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason we know that Paul matches with the liar, and the reasons that Eisenman lays out very clearly, are basically the description of Paul in the Habakkuk Pesher. He was part of the movement for a little while. He left under hostile circumstances. He opposed the law. He preached about blood. He had a false Eucharist that was poured. And he raised up congregations. Now, that's a pretty specific list. How many people at that time check all those boxes? Paul's the only one who fits. Raising up congregations is very distinctive. Preaching about blood, having a Eucharist that's poured, these all fit Paul. So now that character was called the liar in the scrolls. So that's why we call Paul the liar, because he matches a character called the liar in the Habakkuk Pesher of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Eisenman agrees with that. We both agree with that as well. So now our viewers have understood a common ground that we have here. We have a lot of common ground. Some other common ground that we have is that the fourth philosophy equals early Christianity, the Jewish version of Christianity, that it's the same group, that the historical Jesus, whoever he was, whether he was Judah or Judah's son, whoever he was, the historical Jesus was promoting a pro-Torah form of Judaism, and it was Messianic Judaism.
And one of the main teachings when you go into the first couple chapters of Acts is the early Jewish Christians had everything in common. It was like a pure communism.
Yes.
Okay, and as you go farther away from that, then it becomes, that's not emphasized in Christianity today, or even other than monastic movements would go back to those type of passages. But Josephus, when he's talking about the fourth philosophy, they were doing the same thing. Yes. They were given, and he called them lunatics.
Right.
Because, how smart is it to give all your money so that other people can eat and, live?
And think about how distinctive that characteristic of that sectarian idea of having all things in common is. Only one Jewish sect was said to do that. And indeed, only one sect could do it, or there'd be confusion. If you had more than one sect doing it, you might go to the wrong commune. And you never had any stories of somebody showing up at the wrong commune anywhere. So that means only one sect was doing that.
Right.
And that means we've got a unity. We've got an identifying marker. Now, when you find out that there's a whole bunch of other things in common, when you realize that the Dead Sea Scrolls teach the same ideas that Josephus attributed to Judah the Galilean, in Antiquities and Wars, Josephus describes Judah the Galilean's teachings about being free, about having to obey Torah, and only if you are obedient to God will God come in on your side, and that no matter what the cost, you must resist what Rome wants if it's against Torah. And as long as you go with Torah, God will come in and intervene, and he will provide the victory. If we're not strong enough, God is strong enough, and God will help us if we obey Torah. And the angels will come if we're pure enough. So they had a big purity theme. So this makes sense. John the Baptist had the same purity theme idea, and many scholars of many different persuasions like to link John the Baptist with the Dead Sea Scroll community. And this makes sense because he's a baptizer like them. He's working in the Jordan area like them. He's preaching against Herod like them. The Dead Sea, how do I know the Dead Sea Scrolls are against Herod? They talked about the king had to be pure blood Jew on both sides. Herod was half Idumean and half from the tribe of Benjamin. The Dead Sea Scrolls say the king must never get divorced. Herod got divorced. The king must never marry his cousin. Herod married his cousin, divorced that cousin, and married another cousin. Yeah, so there's no way that they aren't anti-Herod. They fit with John the Baptist like a glove also. Right. The timing fits like a glove. When there were two groups that lived in Qumran, they're not the same, but they are related. The Essenes started it off. And then when Herod moved to Jericho, that was too close. They buggered off. They left. Goodbye. And Qumran was left unoccupied till Herod died. Then Judah the Galilean moved in. Now, that's when he took over. Josephus said Judah the Galilean had royal pretensions. What stock do you put in that, Daniel?
What's that? Why did I?
No, Judah the Galilean Josephus said that Judah the Galilean had royal pretensions. What do you make of that?
Well, I could see that. I mean, when you look at first of all, we have to define who Judas the Galilean was, because there are three individuals named Judas that Josephus talks about.
May I stop right away and say, don't call him Judas. That's the Greek form of the name. Okay. He was a Jew. Let's call him Judah, his name.
Okay. There were three Judas. There was the one at the Golden Eagle Temple cleansing, which is right towards the end of Herod the Great's life. Right, with Matthias. There was what Josephus called the robber, who went to, and the robber had messianic ideas. And then there was the tax revolt, Judah, in 6 AD.
Are you saying the robber when you're referring to Judas Sephareus when he stole from the armory?
Right.
Okay.
But those are the three that he talks about. I think it was one. I think it was one person.
I agree.
And Eisenman also.
I agree.
If it's not the same person, they believed exactly the same thing.
Good. I'm just letting you do my work for me there because I agree with that completely. So anyway, I agree with that completely. Other things where we agree, we both learned from Eisenman. John the Baptist opposed the Herodians, and we both have to agree. Well, you mentioned briefly, but you don't emphasize it. That makes him anti-Rome, because the Herodians were the appointees by Rome. So if you're opposing the Roman appointee, you're saying, I don't agree with what Rome's doing here. So that's an important idea. The New Testament's a systematic reversal of the fourth philosophy. I think Eisenman has demonstrated that completely. And he's done this on the basis of what the scrolls teach versus what the New Testament teaches. Mm-hmm. And which brings us to, how do we know what we think we know? And that's, how do we do this business of being a historian? And I would like to recommend to our viewers that the first thing a historian is going to do is prioritize sources. And we're talking about looking at the history of a messianic claimant Jesus as the Messiah. The word Christ means anointed one. Messiah, Mashiach, means anointed one. We're looking at someone who's the anointed Messiah, the anointed king. Anointed one is a term for either a priest or a king, and in this case, a king. And or a priest king, because after the order of Melchizedek, they're both priest and king. Paul tried to twist that into some sort of otherworldly thing, because the New Testament doesn't just, or the Old Testament, the Tanakh does not describe Melchizedek in enough detail. It doesn't tell you where he came from. It doesn't tell you what happened to him. So Paul tries to twist that into making Melchizedek without beginning and without end. Not just because the story didn't mention it. Pretty weak. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about Melchizedek. And they use the term exactly as the term means in the original Hebrew. Melchizedek is from Melchi Zedek, that's Aramaic actually, for righteous king, king of righteousness. And so it fits right in with this king theme. Jesus had to be the messianic king, to be the Messiah, to be the Christ. So back to the idea, how do we know what we know? And that is, we're talking about a messianic movement. So the messianic movement from the first century, then let's prioritize sources that are from the first century. The New Testament sources are not from the first century. They're 4th century at the earliest. So they're weak by comparison. Wherever our first century sources disagree with the later sources, rely on the first century sources with priority.
Although, like when you're looking at like the Gospels and the book of Acts, they are later. Yes. But a lot of times they will show you what was kind of happening in the history.
Yes.
But then you got to go back to the source of Josephus to see, okay, was there a similar type of story there? You can build
and not just Josephus. This is the point I'm trying to make. Josephus is a first century source. That's good. So Josephus is better than the New Testament because it's first century. Josephus is better than the New Testament because he's Jewish, even though he's pro-Roman. Right? He's just as pro-Roman as the New Testament, but he is at least a Jew and understood the Jews. So it's better that way. There's another thing we want to have. It's a messianic movement. So we're better off if our source is messianic. Now, Josephus is not messianic. Right. Yeah, so he doesn't match as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls do there. The Dead Sea Scrolls are first century as well, and they're Jewish, and they're messianic. So I give the Dead Sea Scrolls a higher priority than I give Josephus, and I give Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus a higher priority than I give the New Testament. The New Testament lies to us the most. Josephus lies to us the second most. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are our most reliable source because they're just trying to tell us stuff they didn't even expect us to know about. They hid those scrolls. They weren't trying to tell us anything. They were talking to themselves in their own group. They were keeping their secrets. They weren't trying to convince us of anything. Their ideas were what they really believed. So I prioritize the sources by looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls match with it, then I say that's the part that's true of that later source. So when you talked about Acts, some parts of it trustworthy, some parts of it not. I look at the part that the argument was about circumcision versus non-circumcision. And I look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were arguing about circumcision versus non-circumcision. Oh, that's a real part. That matches the scrolls. It matches the earliest sources. Mm-hmm. You see, so I have a reason for why I select what I select out of the New Testament parts in Acts. Not everything in Acts is trustworthy, but the parts, especially as Eisenman emphasizes, in the we document. The we document is a part of Acts where everything is spoken about in the first person plural. We did this, we did that, next we did the other. And that seems to have had an original source from the Pauline movement to keep track of stuff. So the idea that Paul really went to Jerusalem and argued with James seems to be a real historical part of the story. And so that part seems to be true. And when I go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the same idea. Like we said, we saw the description of the liar. And so that part seems to be historical, that Paul was indeed a renegade against the group, the original group. So we have that in common. And now we know how to prioritize the sources. we'll use the Dead Sea Scrolls for making those determinations. So that's pretty well. We had the early Christian martyrs were Messianic Jews. That's another thing that we have. And pro-law equals revolt. This is an important idea too. When Caligula wanted to put a statue of himself in Jerusalem, the Jews gathered around and said, "You'll have to slit our throats first. We're just not going to live with that." And it was peaceful civil disobedience this time. And you again attribute that to the early Jesus movement, the Messianic Jews. And I agree. This was their way of pro-Torah action, peaceful civil disobedience to stop it. And it worked by luck, because he died. Caligula died.
Well, it helped that they had Agrippa was Caligula's best friend too.
Yeah.
And I think he might have had something to do with the assassination.
Yeah.
Agrippa the First.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just helpful for our viewers to put in the names so they know who we're talking about. We understand each other because we're pretty well informed. I appreciate that. But our viewers want to have those things. Now I got to get to the part where I bite on you a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, without discussing them all, and we'll discuss them all one by one if we want to afterwards. The things that you have to change to traditional thinking for your theory to be right. And I'm not saying this is negates it all. I'm just saying we have to account for all these things for your theory to be right. And we have to account for more things with your theory than with my theory, in my opinion. But here we go. First of all, we have to imagine the early church began in 19 CE. We believe that Paul was moved back from 22 to 45 CE rather than 35 to 58. Mark's gospel was written after 105 CE. Pilate's time began earlier in 18 CE instead of 26. Judah died in 19 CE instead of 6 CE. Judas Iscariot is really another name for Jesus. John the Baptist is a contemporary of Paul. Jesus' brothers must be viewed as Jesus' sons. Zebedee was real. You treat Zebedee like he was real. Jesus must be 25 years older than we thought. And the Christmas star was an eclipse. These are all disputable aspects of your theory. And frankly, most of them disappear with one little tweak. Make Jesus Judah's son, and he goes to the next generation, and all those anomalies in the time period go away, and everything all of a sudden matches. I suggest a different time frame scale in my work reconstructing Jesus, and without changing the dates for Jesus, I assume that he's crucified 30 CE. That's the range is usually 30 to 33. So I'm within the traditional range there. I base it on the Dead Sea Scrolls timing. I use the 20-year prophecy, which you mentioned from the Damascus document. You mentioned that in your book, and we'll get into that. And the 40-year prophecy, that they had an expectation of a 40-year period that was to end in the resurrection of the unique teacher. Now, in your book, you mentioned the resurrection as a motivating thing for them, and I don't concur with that part. I don't believe that they were expecting a resurrection. And this, again, on the prioritization of sources, I use the Dead Sea Scrolls as the priority source. They didn't think their unique teacher had resurrected. They expected him to resurrect after 40 years. And so the return of Jesus was the resurrection, returning from the grave, not from heaven, but from the grave. That's what they were expecting. and that would be 40 years later. Now, they were to start a war, and the idea was that Jesus would resurrect. Well, let me not intrude, push my concept into the scrolls. The scrolls say the teacher of righteousness would resurrect after 40 years. And they were supposed to start a war, and that war was supposed to be won by this resurrected teacher of righteousness. And they started the war in 66 CE, and they were put down in 70 CE. So the climax of the war, 70 CE, appears to be their targeted time for when they thought this resurrection would occur. If that is the correct connection to the scroll's expectation that this period of time in the war was supposed to be the terminus for that resurrection, that means that his death would go back to 30 CE. So this would fit the traditional matching of the date at 30 CE without any conflict or issue in having to switch it anywhere. Furthermore, it fits many other aspects of the story. If Judas the Galilean was the father of Jesus and died in 6 CE, again, not having to shift anything of the traditional
Wait
idea.
a second. How do we know Judah
Right.
died in 6?
We don't. We can only expect. We don't know that, and I will admit that.
There's a passage in Acts that says that the Judas was killed, and then Judas the Galilean.
Yeah, I
totally bogus because
right. I understand your point, but I can't really discuss my timeline and argue all of those right away. We'll get back to that because you deserve an answer for that legitimate objection.
Right.
Okay, that's a legitimate objection right now because I have not answered that yet. So please remind me to get back to that when I go back to how the timelines fit. If Judas the Galilean died in 6 CE, and I started it with an if, okay, to be fair, right? Then Jesus would have become the king at that point. If Judas the Galilean, who had royal pretensions, was their claimant for the throne, all of a sudden, then there's a new claimant now, that would be his son. The idea that Jesus was born traditionally 7 BCE, again, without changing anything, because that fits both birth stories. Explain how it works both. The idea of one birth story was that the shepherds were seeing a star in the sky. And the star was a sign. Now they're working on, the story is obviously working on the Numbers 24 Balaam prophecy idea. You know, scepter shall arise in Judea, star shall arise in Israel. So the star was idea with the king. Would arise. They made it into a literal star in the story. But there was a celestial event in 7 BCE.
It was even a greater celestial event in like 26.
I understand. You're talking about the eclipse of the moon. You're talking about but I'm talking about the celestial event of the 3 slowest wanderers conjuncting for most of the year together. The 3 slowest wanderers are the 3 planets that move the slowest. It's Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. A conjunction of Mercury and Venus with any other planets, they happen all the time because they're on the inside of the solar system and they're whizzing about real fast. So they conjunct and meet up all the time. But the planets further out in the solar system, they're moving really, really slow. It takes a while for them to get around. So the frequency with which they meet up is very, very rare. In fact, 2,300 times less frequent than the other kind. So the fact that all 3 of these slow wanderers met at the same time is totally extraordinary. Furthermore, we have tablets from Babylon that took note of the event and made an interpretation of it. They said it was going to be an important person arising, was being born in this event. And they said they noted that the background of this event in the starry sky was the constellation Pisces. Now, these Babylonian tablets assigned each of their countries around them the different signs of the Mazzaroth, or the zodiac, to their description, and they assign Pisces to Judea. So there's actually Babylonian tablets that do make the idea that Babylonian Magi did recognize at the time that this sign in the sky was a sign of the birth of an important person in Judea. That's on the record in the Babylonian tablets. So the Magi story is not completely without foundation. The idea that Herod slew the innocents, that's without foundation. Herod would never have done that. That's a myth. Herod was a client king on the border, the far border reaches the Roman Empire. He would never have dared stir up that kind of disaster. That part's a myth. But the idea that they were going back, this story, 2 years before, find a child that's 2 years old, matches the same idea, the same date, 7 BCE. Because not only was there that triple conjunction in 7 BCE, but Herod died 4 BCE, but he didn't have any visitors in his last year, 5 BCE, because his last year was spent with a groin infection, which eventually turned to gangrene and killed him. So the idea of 2 years behind it gives you 7 years BCE for the same time period. So both of these match the time period, these stories, for a 7 BCE date. And if that is the proper match, then when Judas the Galilean died, if Jesus was his son, he would have been 12 years old at that time. And that matches the story of Jesus at 12. I must be about my Father's business. No, you're not. I must be about my Father's business. It fits exactly on schedule. Furthermore, Luke said that when Jesus began his ministry, that he was about 30. If he was born 7 BCE, in 26 CE, when he began his ministry, he would have been 32. That fits that period as well. So all these things are fitting just like that, but it gets even more. If my speculation is correct that Judas the Galilean was Jesus' son, I suspect that when Judas the Galilean died in 6 CE, I think that he got crucified then at that time, but it's a speculation I cannot prove. But if it's true, and most scholars do accept that idea, that that's the date he went, then it means another important idea. I believe that Mary was pregnant with Jesus' brother James at that time. That's why James.
What year was
6 CE? In 6 CE, when Judas the Galilean died, I think that James was in the oven at that time. Now,
tradition has James being a very old man at the time that he died.
That tradition is a Roman Catholic tradition based on the idea that James was a brother and a stepbrother and had children by a previous marriage. It's all part of an idea that's part of the concept of the perpetual virginity of Mary, and it's nonsense. The sources are just not believable or trustworthy on that. The Roman Catholic Church Fathers putting nonsense into the storyline in order to defend the perpetual virginity of Mary. It doesn't fit. Going back to the timeline for how I think the timelines fit together the way I put them together, if James was born in 6 CE, and now the royal family are going to be hidden, Joseph, who's probably a close friend or family of Judah, takes over, marries Mary to hide the royal family, to keep them safe, so they have another name. They're not running around saying, I am Yeshua, Bar Yehuda, Bar Hezekiah, Ben David, King of Israel. They're not doing that. They're hiding themselves. He's Joseph. He's Jesus, son of Joseph, and James becomes James, son of Joseph, being hidden from the royal family. But Mary goes on and has more kids. Joseph apparently dies fairly soon because Joseph didn't have any kids with Mary. And we know this because Joseph's brother, Clopas, had to marry Mary in order for him to do Levirate marriage. Leviticus 25, Levirate marriage, the brother steps in. Now, that makes sense because now we have the source for Mary and Clopas give us the other brothers of Jesus. Joseph is the first one in line. He's named after Joseph, which makes sense if it's a Levirate marriage to name the next son after the father that you're having it for. And then after that, you have Simon and Judah, and these all match. When you look at the church fathers' descriptions of their ages, when they got crucified or when they got martyred under Emperor Trajan, it matches in the next couple of years after James was born. In other words, in the next couple of years had to be their birth. All of these dates fit, including the names and ages and dates and the order of birth for matching all of it. And the names of these sons also match the names of Judah the Galilean's sons in the record. It seems to be a perfect fit. Now, my theory could be wrong, right? And your theory could be wrong. We could both be wrong. Okay,
possible, yeah.
Yeah,
I think we got some things in common. I think we got pieces of it. I'm not 100% sure I'm right on everything, but
and that's what makes you a scholar, my friend. The fact that you said that says that you're not just a crank writer. When you can say, I know I might be wrong on some things, that says you're a real person.
Well, you know, as I was writing, like I don't know which book have you read, the
Judas Galilean.
Okay, that was written in 2004. The last one I wrote was 2014, and then I had already made some changes to what I believe.
Okay, interesting.
So you know, it's like as I was piecing together information in 2004 when I wrote that, I had never looked at the Slavonic Josephus, for instance, and most people haven't. The only reason I did is because Eisenman said that there's as much in there that you need to look at as any of these other documents.
I recommend Dave Allen's research, by the way, on the TF, the Testimony Flavinium.
Yeah.
I highly recommend Dave Allen's research on that. He does a very good job of explaining that Josephus probably had a passage there about Jesus in the original that was not pro-Jesus, but was anti-Jesus.
Yeah, I have no doubt.
Yeah, and he does a very good job sourcing it out, including doing an analysis of the Slavonic Josephus and the other versions of Josephus as well.
Well, anyway, with the Slavonic Josephus, as I was reading it the first time, like in 2005, so after I'd written my first book, there were some passages that I thought were interesting. In fact, there's like 13 passages that are added that relate to what you would call the Christian or Jewish Christian experience.
Right.
One of them had to do in right at the cleansing of the temple, the Golden Eagle Temple cleansing. You have a mother and her children, put on the brothers.
Right.
Okay, so that's interesting, but that would say that the brothers were born a lot earlier than 4, 5, 6, 7 BC.
Not necessarily, and plus you're relying on Josephus, and like I say, Josephus, he's more reliable than the New Testament, but he's less reliable than the scrolls. And I'm relying on my dating I'm putting my chronology together based on the scrolls chronology. And that seems to make more sense to me if I can account for that. If I can't account for the scrolls chronology exactly, then I figure I'm failing because they're the priority sources.
Okay, let's look at the timeline of Paul. Okay, when in Galatians he mentions he was in the movement for 17 years before the council.
Right.
Okay.
Once again, no matter what Paul says or anything the New Testament says, when you add up their numbers, if it conflicts with the scrolls, the chronology I get from the scrolls, I just ignore it and say, well, they're lying. Josephus too.
Well, I
wherever
think
Josephus in the New Testament don't match the scrolls, I just say they're lying.
I don't know if he had any reason to lie about those numbers, though.
I think he had a lot of reasons to, because Josephus very intentionally distorts the resistance
I'm
to
talking
Rome.
about when Paul was writing about the times that he visited Jerusalem.
Yeah.
You know, there's a timeline of 17 years.
Right. Okay. And what
then
timeline
when he is in Galatians,
dates,
when he's at Antioch, when he's being confronted, And exactly the same type of occurrence is happening that between King Isaides and Eleazar.
That'd be what, 37 CE roughly, somewhere around there?
That was around 44.
Okay, 44.
Okay.
That all makes sense. That fits the timeline for Paul, as I know Paul. I figured Paul.
But then if you look at Paul, if he's out of the movement at 44,
He wasn't out of the movement by 44.
he was gone after 44.
Paul?
Yeah,
Why do you say that?
because he even says that the Jews turned their backs on him, and this happened around 44. Unless he's teaching all these things about the Gentiles being the actual holders of God's promises, you think the Jews were going to let him back in the movement? They all turned their backs on him, and then he becomes very bitter, and his writings after that are.
Okay, so you're saying, I thought you were saying Paul's gone by 44. I thought like he's over, done, dead or something.
No.
Oh, okay, he's out of the movement by 44.
He's being removed at 44.
Oh, I misunderstood. Yeah, I can agree with that. Yeah, no problem.
That you read about him in Acts later, that is nonsense, because he was out of the movement at that point. So like when he goes to see King Agrippa in 60 AD, or if he goes to see Caesar, towards the end of the book of Acts, those things happen to an individual named Saul in Josephus's writings.
Right, and that's the same as Paul. I mean, that's
the same as Paul, but it wasn't. It was against the movement, not.
Yes, of course. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Paul was working against the movement, yes, especially at Saul
at that time. But in 44, it was like he's teaching against the movement, though they finally catch up with him and kick him out. But then if you use his 17 years, and then you got to have a few years between him at the council and until they finally catch up with him when they're calling him the liar and everything. A few years, no doubt, passed.
When do you think Paul died?
Oh, I think he lived into the 70s, at least. Because there was the Saul figure in Josephus's writings visited Nero in modern day Greece, in 66 AD. So he was
that's possibly Paul.
Yeah,
I don't think he lived past that time period.
I don't know.
I think he was called in before Nero because Nero was mad at him, and Nero was notorious for people he was mad at that didn't survive. Paul had to be out of the picture by at least that time period. Great scholars like the Oxford scholar S.G.F. Brandon have suggested that Paul was out by 55 CE. The reasoning behind it is simply the evidence from the Corpus Paulinum is so ragged, it's so destroyed. Paul didn't have any enemies in the early Roman Catholic Church, the pro-Roman Church. He didn't have any enemies in the Marcionite Church. Paul was beloved to both of them. Paul's only enemies were James and his crew. Right. So there had to be a time when James and his crew had complete domination and Paul had no control whatsoever for his writings to become so ragged. 2 Corinthians, for example, is 3 different Pauline epistles stitched together, and they don't even all match each other. They're somewhat contradictory. So this is powerful evidence that Paul had to be restrained somehow, either in jail or dead, and unable to do anything to stop these guys from doing what they did to all his writings in Asia Minor.
Well, I think when you're talking from 40, 50, 60, I don't think Paul was anywhere near as strong as the Jewish apostles and the whole fourth philosophy movement. I mean, they didn't get wiped out. I think once they got wiped out with the war, I think the Pauline teachings then got the upper hand. But before that, they weren't.
That's right. There were two processes after the war that happened to the different divergent groups. The Pauline Christians, they took over and they ended up becoming the religion of the empire eventually.
Right.
The Jewish Christians, they were so scared, all their leaders were really wiped out. And so what was left of the mystic Jews with all their esoteric experiences and the Dead Sea Scroll community with the heavenly ascents and everything else, they carried on their stuff without their teachers explaining what was happening to them. And all of a sudden you got the Gnostics developed from that. Mm-hmm. So that's what the remnants of those groups went and became. So the Gnostics have very weird, strange ideas, but it comes from heavenly ascent experiences.
Yeah.
Which is, we're talking rabbis on drugs, so you figure.
Well, anyway, going back to Paul, he's out of the movement at 44. Okay. You have 17 years when he started the movement to the time that he got to the Council of Jerusalem or whatever. Mm-hmm. Then you got a few more years until he gets kicked out of the movement. So let's say it's a total of 20 years. Mm-hmm. His 17 years plus another 3 years until they finally kick him out because they figured out exactly what he's teaching. Because remember, Paul said to the Jews, I'm like a Jew, to the Gentiles, I'm like a Gentile, which meant that he lied to them. What
he's a weasel.
He told them what they wanted to hear. But after a while, the news comes back. What's he really teaching? And they find out and they get rid of it.
Right.
Okay. But if you take those 20 years and you subtract it from 44, you got 24.
Yeah, well,
you got him starting in the movement in the early 20s.
That doesn't make sense. That's where all the other Pauline scholars completely disagree with that. You know that you're alone in that.
I know I'm totally alone, but it's the only thing that makes sense.
Well, no, there's another thing that makes sense. Except Paul was a liar. It's Paul exaggerated the numbers. Paul was wrong.
No, but those same Pauline scholars say that Paul was the guy that was running around at the end of the book of Acts. That was not a Paul that was with the church. That was a Paul that was against the church. And they did a good job of getting him out of Jerusalem before 62 AD, because that's when James was stoned.
Well, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that particular detail.
Yeah, well, I think though when you put that along with then you got John the Baptist, the Slavonic Josephus introduced him in 6 AD.
Yes, the New Testament and Josephus disagree on the timing of John the Baptist.
Yes.
Yeah. So
and even the death of John the Baptist.
Yes.
But the Slavonic Josephus have him being introduced the same time that Zadok is introduced in antiquity.
And I suspect that Zadok was John the Baptist. I agree with you on that. And Josephus being coy about it, or he should have told us.
Right. Well, if he did, it could have been changed too.
That's true too. That's another good point. Because Josephus has been edited, and the New Testament's been edited. So,
so you have, let's say with Zadok, you have him being introduced by Josephus in Antiquities in 6 AD. Okay, mm-hmm. And then in 36 AD, he talks about John the Baptist dying because he's up against Herod Antipas.
Right.
So you've got an introduction of Zadok, but no end to him, even though he's one of the most important teachers of the time.
Yeah. Well, how come Josephus didn't give us more details there?
And he didn't give us any details about Judas the Galilean either. And
that's correct.
Says these are the guys
starting me not trust him when Josephus discusses the rebel movement against Rome. You can't trust him. He will distort things on purpose in order to make his case. And his case is basically that Jews aren't rebels, they're philosophers. That the various sects of Judaism are like the various philosophies. And he wants to make this kind of idea that the Essenes were like the Stoics and things like that, etc. And when he described he used Greek terms. He called the overseer the president, It's actually this. I'm sorry, that's Pliny describing the therapeuti, but same idea too. But anyway, the bias that he has, because Josephus, he's Flavius Josephus because he's part of the Flavian family, was adopted by the emperor. So you got a guy adopted by the emperor writing about the people who were rebelling against the emperor. Can you trust him? No. Will he distort it? Yes. Will he try to twist the story to make certain things appear to be impossible? So someone who knows, who's telling someone the truth, who's read Josephus, but someone else knows the real history, they're going to say, I read Josephus. That can't be true. And so the idea, I think that the dates for when Judah the Galilean's sons died, he gives, the date, he gives in the 40s. And yet there was nothing happening at that time that would have caused them to be crucified.
Well,
and Josephus doesn't even tell us why they just says that's the time that they were slain. He doesn't even say how they were executed, just they were slain at that time.
No, in 40, the two sons of Judas the Galilean that were killed were crucified.
Right, crucified. Okay,
so they're crucified, and it happens shortly after Herod or Agrippa first dies.
Okay,
he dies in 43. They're imprisoned and then are put to death around 45, 46.
And
now,
is it
also
possible
relates to the story in the Book of Acts where you've got a Simon Peter and a James that are imprisoned. Okay, right. And then it's interesting that the sons of Judas the Galilean were Simon and James,
exactly
the ones that were crucified. So it happened at a certain time, but it was after the king dies. So you could see there was probably an upheaval at that time.
Probably, the point is Josephus doesn't actually mention an upheaval at the time. And you would think because he mentioned all the others. And it makes me wonder if he wasn't just making it up that they died then. Is it possible that he was just trying to cover it up and that the James, that was involved, the Jacob that was involved, is really the same one who actually was stoned to death in 62 CE. Yeah, and that Josephus, by giving him a different time period for saying, oh, he got crucified at this time, is a way of covering up, stopping the rest of the story and the real possible alternative truth from coming out. Now, that's a speculation that I'm putting in there. I don't say that's what it is, but it could have been. And I don't trust Josephus enough to say for sure that it wasn't.
Well, yeah, when I'm looking at like the New Testament Book of Acts and I see things that they kept in that book, and I think the whole thing has been whitewashed and turned around and everything, but there are events in there that kind of match up. Like I said, you got the two apostles that are being imprisoned,
right,
happening at the same time, of the exact same names, sons of Judas the Galilean, that were imprisoned.
Right.
And so there are things that you can look in the Book of Acts and go, okay, there are things that they're talking about. Now they're changing, they're tweaking things, but there were important things that happened in that movement that they're still keeping in the Book of Acts, but they're just rewriting it a little.
They're rewriting, yes. And I think that's great that you explain that for the viewers, because a lot of viewers take things in the Bible at face value, and you can't.
No.
And so thank you for that.
Well, I think the biggest one was the talking about the death of Judas the Galilean, and all scholars go, well, he died after the tax census of 6 AD. Well, that's that passage where they talk about Theudas, and then after him came Judas the Galilean. Well, actually what happened, Theudas was killed in like 45, 44. And after him, after Theudas dies, it's the sons of Judas the Galilean.
Right. Now, if it's the same Theudas, and it could be
wrong. They're downplaying Judas the Galilean in the Book of Acts.
They definitely are. And there's a lot of confusion about the whole Judas Judas, Thomas idea.
Oh,
They
yeah.
all get twisted together. Thomas, by the way, is simply the Aramaic word for twin. They said Didymus Thomas. Didymus is a Greek word for twin. So we're talking twin. The guy's named Twin. Well, that's not a made up name. I don't know what is. So that's all made up. And then you got Thomas and you got Judas, and you mix together and you get Judas.
Yeah.
I don't know that these aren't distortions of one another, or they could be completely separate characters.
Yeah. One other point I want to make about the Judas the Galilean story in the book of Acts. It also, to prove that his everything just fell apart after he dies, he says all his disciples were scattered. So he was a one-hit wonder. Okay, Josephus #1 says that Judas' followers grew, and they were fanatics.
Yes,
okay?
Yes.
And also, if you look at
Suetonius and Josephus all said that there was the messianic prophecy, the expectation of a world leader to arise out of Judea, took the nation by storm. That he called an infection, and he said even the leaders were deceived by it. So Josephus goes on in description to say the nation was carried away with it. Infected to an incredible degree. That's a quote from Josephus. Infected to an incredible degree. Tacitus says the whole country.
But does that
says the majority of the Jews?
I guess that doesn't sound like somebody whose whole movement fell apart.
No, it didn't. No.
Okay, but when you look at how they describe Jesus's movement, after he was captured in Mark and Matthew, his disciples deserted him. And then in Acts chapter 8, the disciples, when they were having all their problems and being persecuted, they were scattered.
Well, this is all part of the New Testament twist.
Galilean.
Yeah.
But yet we assume that they all, did well.
Yeah. The New Testament twists everything that way. I forgot where I was going to go with that. Yeah. Anyway, there's always a twist in the New Testament compared to what really happened. They twisted Jesus's family. I hate him. They said that he was crazy and he's beside himself. The complete opposite of the original movement. Jesus' family were an important part of the early movement and took over the role. I think James Tabor's done a very good job in his book, The Jesus Dynasty, of showing how James and his successors, Simon and Judah after him, took over the role of the king of this early movement. They're claimant for the throne. So in there, Jesus founded a dynasty. And that, again, how do I test which theory? We hear all these different theories, your theory, my theory, everybody else's theory. How do we know which one we can rely on? Well, we don't know, but we can suspect a stronger support for those that have better prioritized sources. And the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm this idea of a king that they were expecting. Their leader, he was a king. They referred to him as the righteous king, Melchizedek. They also referred to him as the Netzer, which Netzer means the branch in Hebrew. So the branch is the Old Testament term for the heir to David's throne. The branch of David is the Messiah. And so the Messiah is also called the branch. He's called the Netzer. Followers of the Messiah were called Netzarim. So that became Nazarene. In fact, the word Netzarim and the word Nazorim are spelled exactly the same. They have the same consonants in Hebrew, and you don't use vowel pointing at that time period. That wasn't invented until 400 CE under the Masoretes. Without the vowel pointing, when you write down Netzarim and you write down Nazarim, it looks exactly the same letters. Nazarim is from the Hebrew word Nazor, which means to keep or to guard. So they were guardians or keepers. Phrase that they use is keepers of the covenant. So Again, I go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if they match it up and they back it up, then I know I'm on the right track. And so they were Netzarim and they were Nazarene. They were followers of the Netzer, the branch Netzarim, and they were keepers of the covenant. That's Nazarene Habri. Netzarim, the collective plural, becomes Netzarim or Nazarene. Yeah. And in the New Testament, the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 25, it specifically says that the name Nazarene is a sectarian name. It's not the name of the place Jesus came from. It's not the name of a town. It's the name of the sect.
Right.
And it says it's a sectarian name, and they spell it out in Acts as Nazarios, Nazorios, with an omega in there. Where's the omega in Nazareth? There's no omega in Nazareth. There's no O in Nazareth. There's an O in Nazorim, and that's because that's the word in Hebrew is Nazorim. So he transliterated it to Greek, get Nazorias in Greek. That's why the omega is there. So it tells you where it came from. It came from the Hebrew term Nazarene Habri, which is the term from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's how I know the real meaning of the term Nazarene, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are the priority sources. So we know the New Testament is lying when it says Nazarene, Jesus, the Nazarene, means Jesus of Nazareth. We know that's a distortion. And other parts of the New Testament don't put Nazarios, they put Nazarios and change it, trying to make the twist towards Nazareth because it's a cover story. They didn't want people to know that Jesus was a Nazarene sectarian member. They wanted to think, no, he's just from Nazareth. He's from that place over there. As if every Nazarene was from Nazareth. No, the Nazarenes were from all over the place, keepers of the covenant. And they didn't want that association made because the Dead Sea Scroll community were planning the war with Rome. Their war scroll describes specifically how they were going to run their war, and they had practice campaigns and things. And the idea was that the priests would be the generals and that they would be using the shofar to blow out trumpets, just like the bugle was used as a signal in the American military. They, you know, up you get, good morning, right? And whatever it is, charge, right? Retreat, whatever it is, they use the bugle for these things. Well, the shofar would have done the same, and charge, whatever the signal was. And Josephus, the New Testament did not want the readership of their writings to know that Jesus was part of the revolt against Rome.
No, I mean, you don't want the Prince of Peace
to
be the leader of the rebels, especially
right.
when the whole idea of the movement after the destruction of the temple is to raise money.
Yes.
And if you're raising money in Roman society, you don't want to be rebels against Rome.
Right.
You're not going to do real well.
That's right. And the idea of being pro-Torah means you're anti-Rome comes about for many different reasons. For example, the Romans had coins with the emperor's picture on it, a graven image. That's against the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt, no graven images. They ascribed divinity to the emperor in the inscriptions, the saying that he's divine. That's blasphemy. So these are both against Torah. And it wasn't just their coins, even their shields and their standards. They had the same thing, the images on them. So when the Romans came in and put their shield up on the gate of Jerusalem, or they had their standards marching through Jerusalem, the most pious of Jews said, we've got to stop this. We've got to stop this.
Well, the golden eagle temple cleansing with Judas, Judas.
Yeah.
Or Judah. Yeah, you got me on that one. That was the golden eagle of Rome.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why they tore it down. I mean,
absolutely.
This was a movement against Rome. So it goes all the way back to 4 or 5 BC, or even way before that.
Absolutely. It goes back to the Maccabees and the whole idea against the Seleucids and Antiochus, etc. Right. The Dead Sea Scroll community and Judah Galilean's community, the same community, they were inheritors of the Maccabean ethos.
Exactly. even the names you've got the
Matthias
and Judas, Maccabee, but then you got Matthias and Judah at the Golden Eagle Temple cleansing.
And you got Matthias as part of the family of Jesus' family in the ancestral lines in the New Testament claims as well.
Right. So I think we're in agreement there. The timelines were a little bit off.
We changed a little bit there.
It's kind of hard in just talking. I mean, I would hope people would read everything that you put out and actually read my newest book was called Judas of Judas of Nazareth.
All right. Hey, you know what? I got to send you a copy of my book, and you got to send me a copy of yours. I want an autographed copy.
Okay.
Is that fair?
That's fair.
All right. And then, the 20-year prophecy. I hate not fulfilling prophecies. The 20-year thing in the Damascus document mentions about how the scroll community wandered for 20 years like blind men, groping for the way, and then God saw that they searched for him with a perfect heart, and sent them a teacher of righteousness who would show them the way. And it did several things in that this teacher of righteousness showed them the way. That's the very term used for the early Christians, followers of the way. And that the term the way, Derek in Hebrew, is the same as Hodos, Greek, the same thing exactly. They couldn't say it any clearer. And then it goes on to say, and he would show them the last generation, what was going to happen to the congregation of traitors. And I think that's a reference to Paul, and his ilk, that they're telescoping the history in that, because they're looking back. From their perspective, they're looking back at their teacher who's dead when they're writing this, and they're looking back at the time they've already had the liar come and go out of their movement as well. And they're looking back and saying, he told us that this would all happen. The teacher told us that this was going to happen. He prophesied it, and he knew that people like this liar were coming. The idea that there was a 20-year period, my suggestion that Jesus was the son of Judah fits that in this idea. I suggest that when Judah died, and I suggest he did die in 6 CE, and that, again, that's my, you note that most scholars take that position, that he died at that time. So I run with that idea and ask, well, let's see if for all the different reasons the other scholars use that position, let's see if it fits. Judah the Galilean was the founder of the fourth philosophy. Josephus said he started the fourth sect, and he was Sophistes. And the 20-year period starts when the sect that's already been founded. These sectarians couldn't be wandering as sectarians if their sect hadn't been founded yet. So the sect had already been founded, and then the 20-year period started when they were wandering. And after that 20-year period, the teacher of righteousness arrived. So if Judah the Galilean, as the founder, when he died, if the 20-year period started in 6 CE, then the teacher of righteousness showed up in 26 CE, which is exactly fitting the traditional idea of when Jesus started. So again, all my dates fit like a glove, and I don't have to bounce anything around. I don't have to bounce the time for when Pilate was in there. I don't have to change the time when Mark was written. I don't have to change it to all these other things, that long list of things that don't fit, and they all fit like a glove. Now, I could be wrong, and you could be right, and all those things need adjustment. But you have to adjust a lot more things to take your idea than to take mine. That's all I'm saying.
When I look at the timelines, I talked about Paul's timelines. You got John the Baptist timeline. Even Pilate, when I was reading Eisenman, he'd always make a point. He goes, well, he came into office either in 18 or 26. Josephus has him at 26, right. But if you actually look at the text, it's like he mentions all these 18 and 19.
Yeah, the math doesn't add up for 26 is what you're saying. So, right. So you're looking at either the date is wrong or the time period in between is wrong.
or it could have been changed.
It could have been changed. Yes.
I mean, essentially, if
doesn't always.
The passage about Jesus in Josephus that everyone says, that probably is not original.
Mm.
That's in the same section of where the pilot information is. So everybody, all these scholars are saying, oh, they probably changed this, but they never even consider that they could have changed the pilot stuff.
Exactly.
Because if before Pilate's introduced, you got 18 AD events. Pilate's introduced, 26. And then right afterwards, more 18 AD events. And then Pilate's introduced again. Okay, we're at 26. Then right after it, we're back to 18. So the 2 times that Pilate's mentioned, if it's at 26, it doesn't make sense.
So those numbers
and that's why Eisenman's looking at this stuff.
Or the numbers that he said for the times in between have to be wrong. What it boils down to is Josephus is not completely reliable. And the New Testament's not completely reliable, and we're juggling a bunch of faulty, fragmentary sources.
Well, that's why we'll never 100% know for sure.
That's right.
But we can put our best guesses forward.
That's right. And I want to thank you because
all the great scholars are putting their guesses forward too, because they don't know either.
Exactly. We all have a right to make our own best guess on this. Basically, my attempt is, does my theory, without any magic or miracles, explain all the available evidence? And it does. Mine does. Without having to twist or make any other adjustments on the dates and timings of unique things like that. So I like that. I like that you're willing to think outside the box. You're willing to recognize that the story's been twisted and we have to untwist it to find out the truth. Now, to untwist it, that's a process that involves a lot of speculation and guessing, and we do our best. And I salute you for having a very readable book and an enjoyable alternative view of an interpretation of the Jesus history. And I think we have a lot of common ground.
I do too.
I think that's a wrap there. Jacob, what do you think?
I agree. I think that's a great conclusion. Yeah,
Okay.
I've enjoyed listening to both of you talk. It seems to have gone very well.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you two both agree on a whole lot of things. But there's obviously some differences, some of them major. But yeah, I think you both agree, possibly more than not.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Daniel.
Thanks
Thank you,
a
Jacob.
lot. I enjoyed it.
Me too.
Yep, I did too. And I thank both of you for coming on my show once again. And maybe we can get together again at some point later.
Okay.
I don't see why not.
Yep.
I look forward to reading your new book, Daniel.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Maybe after we sign off, we can get you can give me your address and I can.
Jacob, we got all the information. You can give it to him.
Let me play the outro real quick and end the stream, and then we'll discuss.
Okay.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.